Welcome in, LSU fans, and hopefully a happy Thanksgiving. You're getting to tune into this before you indulge on your Thanksgiving feast. My name is Bryce Koon alongside Glen West. And Glen, we have to start this out by the big news, or I guess the big topic of conversation. Brian Kelly was asked this today, so I'm going to ask you, what's your go-to? I'll give you meat and two sides. What has to be on that Thanksgiving plate?
Um, well, I guess turkey for sure. I'm a like Brian Kelly, a traditionalist, I guess you could say. And then my favorite two side dishes probably. Hmm, oh, you put me on the spot here, Bryce. I didn't know this was where we were starting. Sweet potato casserole, which is almost like a dessert, but it's part of the main meal.
Yep. Yep.
And then just some kind of dressing. I don't know whether it's cornbread dressing or just some kind of veggie dressing. I mean, any kind of dressing really. So yeah, just pretty traditionalist. Honestly, my favorite food though for Thanksgiving is the turkey sandwiches after
Ooh.
Thanksgiving. Those are the best.
Yeah. No, that's good. I am not a like 10 out of 10 fan of turkey. My uncle does a good smoked ham,
Oh,
and so I like that. But then I got to go when I go sides. I'm not going to pick what you picked. My grandmother makes a really good mac and cheese.
okay.
So a homemade mac and cheese. And then my wife actually, she kind of got me in on this, and I kind of like it now. Cranberry sauce, homemade cranberry sauce. I look, my
I
family
can't do cranberry
they
sauce.
they ate the canned kind for so long. I was like, I'm not touching that. That looks weird. But a homemade cranberry sauce is not terrible. It's very much different than what you get out of the can. So
All right,
that's it. But hey, we
take
uh, we
your word
hope you have a
for it.
great Thanksgiving, and we hope that you have a good Thanksgiving along while you're watching this, maybe after, or maybe you're traveling and you're listening to it. Make sure you give us a like and a follow on all those platforms of where you're watching or listening. Glenn, a big day today. We're recording this here on Monday evening, and it was in my opinion, one of the better press conferences in terms of how candid Brian Kelly was. I mean, it was very direct. I wouldn't say aggressive by any means, but that's one of the words we're going to use tonight when we talk about maybe some off-season plans. Now, don't get me wrong, LSU still has a big game against Oklahoma looming here on Saturday night, but I wanted your kind of takeaways before we dive into kind of, no pun intended, the meat and potatoes of all of this. But your thoughts on how Kelly handled today's presser, because I enjoyed it as a media member, and I think fans also enjoyed. Okay, like that's real raw emotion coming from the head ball coach.
Yeah, it was pretty informative, and we'll dive into the specifics of kind of what he said, and maybe kind of give our own thoughts on it here in a minute. But just kind of a general idea or breakdown of what kind of the whole press conference turned into. It was essentially a what's going to happen this offseason kind of press conference for Brian Kelly, and he
Mm-hmm.
was asked several questions about transfer portal and 2025 recruiting class, and not directly about the 2025 recruiting class because he can't get into like specific players and
Yeah,
things of that nature, and then also player retention and all that stuff. So essentially, it was an end of season press conference before the end of the season for Coach Kelly today, and I thought he was as blunt as he's been about just kind of the change, I guess the changing of the guard of his thought process for this season. Past couple of years, LSU has not been all that aggressive when it comes to the portal. They've gotten some really great players. Obviously, that first year they had to get a lot of players just to fill the roster up, but he really kind of diverted the attention away from not 2 years ago, but last year when LSU just was not all that aggressive of getting kind of the top tier portal guys. They got some
yeah,
impact players, some guys that have played a lot of football for him this year, whether it's CJ Daniels or Jordan Gilbert or Gio Paez. You can kind of go down the line of those 4 or 5 names. Xavier Thomas certainly in that mix as well. But the one thing that I think that LSU is really going to try to do is they're going to try to swing for the fences this year with a couple of the top names, whoever that might be, that enter the transfer portal this year at several key positions. And so he said all the right things today. I know the first reaction for the fans and honestly for us covering them is just hopefully they put their money where Brian Kelly's mouth is, and I
yeah.
think that's going to be extremely important for this program to be aggressive in those conversations. They have, we'll get into more specifics here, but they have some some freed up money now, some extra freed up money that they can use at their disposal to not only get the portal players they want, but also kind of lock in these 2025 players in the 2025 class that they're hoping to sign here on December 4th. So just kind of he gave a whole bunch of I don't want to, it wasn't word salad, but just a bunch of kind of general ideas of kind of why their trajectory or kind of their focus or game plan has changed in terms of how they want to handle the next several weeks, which are honestly going to be some of the more important of his entire tenure here in Baton Rouge.
Yeah, and I thought it was important how you just said there at the end, most important and probably maybe the most impactful of what his legacy as the LSU head coach will be going forward. Glenn, let's kind of start with the aggressiveness in the portal in terms of that. And I believe, he was asked the question in terms of what has pushed you all to really want to be more aggressive in this cycle compared to other ones. And Brian Kelly used a word that I think we'd all like to use, but I guess you really can't use because it's not legal in terms of calling it this, but it's a cap. And he talked about their NIL cap and it not being essentially, in so many words, where it needs to be for LSU to be able to have the disposable money, I'll say, to be able to spend where they wanted to.
Where it needs to be up until now.
Yes, up until now. So that has changed. It feels like the organization of NIL has changed. Now, a lot of people are going to focus in on, well, Glen and Bryce, why didn't that mean they go get Bryce Underwood? Well, Kelly kind of hinted the fact that, in a separate question, that you have to be worried about the health of your overall program. And that while the quarterback position is very important, you have to be concerned with improving all aspects of the roster. And I think for all of us, we can sit here and say that this LSU team isn't just a quarterback away from competing in the college football playoff. They have deficiencies elsewhere. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how aggressive do you think this group is really going to be? And what did you take away from Kelly's comments when he said, we will be aggressive, and talked about needing to make sure that the entire roster should be filled out, not just focusing in on one piece?
Yeah, I think to me, probably the word aggressive is going to be thrown around a lot by a lot of the local media and certainly whoever catches a hold of it in terms of fans and whatnot. But to me, the kind of the meat of what he was saying there was essentially that they're working really closely right now with Austin Thomas, with Frank Wilson, with Brian Kelly himself to put together a game plan for how they want to attack this thing. And I think in terms of just the aggressiveness part is going to be what it is, and like I think there's a lot of just trying to figure out the best way to phrase this. There's going to be a lot of swings taken this next couple months, and certainly these next couple weeks after once the portal opens and you kind of get some clarity on who's leaving, who's staying. But I think probably for me, the part that stood out the most in terms of how aggressive they're going to be was when he was just talking about the crucial guys that they're hoping to retain. Like I think for me, like there's an avenue here where you can not only swing for the fences with a couple of portal guys, but you can also retain a guy like a Mason Taylor. You can make the best case for him. He talked about on Monday. CJ Daniels is a guy that they feel really good about getting back next year into the fold for the offense. Emory Jones is another one that I think LSU will have conversations with about continuing to have him back for a senior year. And these guys that I just mentioned, Jones and Taylor in particular, they're LSU guys through and through. Like you can really tell they love this program. There's a reason why LSU gives them to us so much to talk to throughout the season. Like they're going to say the right things. They're going to do the right things. They're going to go about their business the right way. And those are the kind of players that Kelly wants in the program. And so now the fact that you've kind of opened up this extra cash flow here, or that you've spent the last year maybe saving for this year in terms of what you want to do, that's going to be extremely interesting to me, because the first part of this, and we'll get into it, but the first part that Kelly talked about is player retention. And we wrote about it on Monday. I have a piece out on Monday about it. They want to keep, I think, a good core of this unit intact and supplement kind of the rest of it with the freshman class, and certainly with what kind of star players you can bring in via the portal. But the first part is trying to figure out a way to get a couple of these veterans to stick around for another year. And I think, honestly, Jones and Taylor would be at the top of my list in terms of who they can try to convince to get back. And then we can get into kind of what the portal and certainly the signing class and how you can close out on that aspect and what that looks like. But what about you? Like, what did you take away from the aggressive part of what Brian Kelly was saying? Because I think that there's a couple different levels to it, and he touched on
Yeah.
some of it. But I think for me, first and foremost is getting some more veterans back into this group, guys that have performed at a high level as opposed to keeping veterans just to keep veterans. These are guys that not only will come back, but they'll develop and they'll be really productive for you next year. Like, that's the kind of players that I would love to see LSU continue to have on this roster next year.
Yeah, I think that there's a really good point to that. We know that Brian Kelly loves continuity. I mean, that was the message in last year. I mean, right? Like retention. How can we keep the guys that we have on our roster? How can we up the ante in terms of NIL, in terms of what they need to feel like this is still the best place for them? So I think that's definitely a key component to like what you were talking about. I think when I heard aggressive, I mean, I think that part of me, and I'll take where I think a lot of this is going to run to, is that, there's a sense of urgency with Brian Kelly and LSU, not in the sense where he's ever going to look us in the face and panic. I don't think that's who he is. He has kind of very stoic mannerisms in terms of how he handles the media and stuff like that. He's not a highly over emotional. Yeah, I know the memes and the gifs from week 1 in Vegas, but he's not a highly over emotional person. When he does show emotion, I think it's very rare in those instances in terms of being high or low. But to that point, Glenn, is I think there's a sense of urgency for LSU this offseason of, you know, everyone talked about year 3 coming in, and I think a lot of people, especially after the Ole Miss win, were thinking, okay, yeah, that's right, year 3. And in reality, this roster was never where it needed to be. I mean, the questions that we had in the offseason, the questions that we maintained through fall camp, were never answered, and they are, I guess you could say, they were answered in the opposite way of where fans wanted them to be. So it's still something where this roster has to get to a point where it's college football playoff contender level. It's still not there. And so what I think being aggressive means, in my opinion, and want to get your thoughts on this, is you got to identify those holes. So after you sit down with your veteran leaders, which we know Kelly likes a lot, and you say, okay, are you coming back? Are you coming back? And you kind of get that sense of those core players that are going to be a part of next year's puzzle. You kind of look and say, okay, where do we need to fill in next? I mean, we need to go get a number 1 receiver. We need to, go get some help along the defensive line. Now, we need to go get, maybe there's a high impact corner that they can go get, a high impact safety, something where you can facilitate the young guys who I think can be very talented on this roster, but you have to go get some veteran help. And it can't just be, and this is for lack of better words, it can't just be a body. I think that you're kind of done in terms of LSU and needing and getting guys that are just bodies that have some experience, because you do have some young players where for them, it's push comes to shove. I mean, either you get to play this next year in 2025 or you're out. And I think some of those guys are experiencing that this year. And we'll have a piece later this week about who could be jumping in the portal, and I'll give a case on why and why they shouldn't jump in. So it to me, Glenn, it's more of step 2. Yours is like, to me, step 1. Take care of what's on your roster, take care of the retention factor, and then identify those holes and be aggressive. Now, do I think that they're going to go pay Walter Nolan money for a defensive lineman? I don't think so, Glenn, but I'll tell you, this sport surprises us all the time. And if they're really truly being aggressive, then when big names hit the market, that's who they're going to go after. And it's going to be very interesting for me to see kind of where they go, where they look, what are the positions they look at, because there are deficiencies. But, the good thing is, and we can talk about this for a second, is that with all of this, talk around the quarterback position and Bryce Underwood, I mean, it's pretty safe to say, at least I feel like, that Garrett Nussmeier is going to be suited up when you take on Clemson next fall. Like, that's going to be your QB1. So in that scenario, is the most expensive position on the market. You have a guy that you think can make that jump in year 2 that he needs to make. You just got to find the puzzle pieces elsewhere to avoid, I think, what happened this year, where they weren't aggressive and those deficiencies were pretty glaring.
Yeah, I think if there was going to be a position that LSU would spend Walter Nolan type of money on, I mean, if there's a superstar receiver that enters the portal, like,
Yeah.
go get that guy. Like, go try to get him. I don't know who that would be. I don't even want to speculate on who that could be, but like there's going to be some guys in there that I think LSU is going to um, have a seat at the table with, and will recruit heavily. But I think you also have to wait and see how this plays out with the one thing that I will say, and that I think the staff will be a little bit more um, keen on this year, or at least you hope they are. Last year, I think they were, at least in the December portal, they were still waiting to hear back on which of these veterans would return, which ones would be going off to the NFL. The transfer portal guys hit the portal right away. It's the guys that were maybe kind of on the fence about staying or going from the NFL draft. And you look at defensive tackle with Mason Smith and Mekhi Wingo being the prime example. I think LSU felt like they were going to get one or both of those guys back last year. And when in January rolled around and all the big names had kind of gone into the portal and signed elsewhere or committed elsewhere, LSU had no options when those guys left and when they went pro. So it's going to be extremely important, I think, for LSU to have an understanding of who's going to be on the roster this year, or who's going to be returning on the roster for next year. And then when you do have that understanding, or even if you don't have that understanding, still be aggressive at positions of need. And for me, like positions of need are certainly wide receiver, defensive line, like you mentioned. I think they could probably use an edge rusher, or they could probably use a defensive tackle. Even with Jacoby and Guillory coming back and a couple of the young guys like Bro and McKinley, I think you could probably still use another tackle. Certainly a safety, probably two safeties if you can. Like I think safety is going to be huge area of concern for LSU if they don't address it in the portal. And then certainly I think you look at the did I mention offensive line? Because I think offensive line is going to be huge. Like you're going to be losing 4 starters this year at least. And like I think that you've got to have a game plan ready. And I think it's part of that's going to come through the freshman class. Hopefully part of it's already on the roster. But if there is a group that needs some veteran presence next year that you don't feel like you might be getting with some of these guys who are going to kind of be the next man up, offensive line would be one of the first calls that I'm looking at, one of the first calls I'm making to some of these guys that enter the portal with opportunity to play right away. So, I think that's a roundabout way of saying, like, LSU better be on their P's and Q's this go around on what exactly their current roster situation is going to be, and have a plan of attack for it when they hit the portal on December 9th. And I think that's a big reason why Austin Thomas was brought here. Certainly he's going to help out with the funding and kind of the resources and all that stuff with the portal, but having just kind of everything broken down. Okay, if this guy leaves, here's what we have to do. If this guy stays, what can we still do to kind of help supplement that room? Those are the kinds of things that I think he can be really beneficial and helpful for. And why Brian Kelly mentioned him today as part of his press conference is one of the 3 guys. It's him, Frank Wilson, and Austin Thomas, who are kind of putting this big board together and having daily meetings about their plan of attack. So I think LSU's, they've got to be on top of it this year in terms of what their roster is going to look like when these players make their decisions. And if they don't make their decisions, you've got to operate from an understanding that they're going to go pro, or that they're going to, you got to operate like they're not going to be a part of the roster.
Yeah, no, I do agree with you. And it's a different day and age. And I kind of asked Brian Kelly that question. I said, a lot of people have kind of labeled him as a CEO type of head coach. And I think that he is kind of realizing, just in my opinion, that you really do have to be maybe more hands-on within, maybe close to where he was when he was getting started at the FBS level, when he was at Central Michigan and then Cincinnati. Like, you have to be more hands-on just with every single thing going on in college football. And you mentioned Austin Thomas, Frank Wilson. He mentioned those 2 alongside himself, kind of being the 3 guys that are really going to be, I don't want to say the liaisons, but really kind of head up that roster management. And Glenn, I think a lot of it reminds me of when I'm talking about pro sports, like the general manager, the front office executives. Those are kind of your 3. It feels like when it comes to roster management in general. I wanted to get to this quote, but as we talk a little bit more about this, Brian Kelly talked about the quarterback position. And obviously, the chatter in the media room before was like, how does somebody ask him about Bryce Underwood but not explicitly mention him? And Kelly mentioned this. He said they will most likely still add to the position this offseason. The quote says, I think we will always be taking a look at quarterback each year. We'll most likely take a quarterback again this year. But we do look at the calendar year a little bit differently than just December. We have that February signing period. We have the transfer portal. So we'll continue to look at that and see how that best fits our roster. He later says, but I can tell you this, that the overall roster is much more important than one particular position. As much as we want a quarterback at this spot, I think what's more important is the overall health. And if so, it ends up being that we do take a quarterback. That's great. But I think that our eye is on the strength of the roster. This afternoon I tapped into a couple of people on this and just kind of got their thoughts on it in kind of around the program. And one of the big takeaways for me was it's going to be interesting to see, we're going to get more into this as we get closer to portal time, which we're almost there. What does the attrition look like at this position? Like we assume Garrett Nussmeier is going to stay. You've got a player who has SEC experience, AJ Swan. Is that a guy who would want to, he spent a year down here. Does he want to try to pursue a starting job elsewhere? You have, two young guys that really haven't played a lot. Ricky Collins has taken several snaps this season, but him and Colin Hurley are those two guys that, maybe they thought they'd be battling Bryce Underwood for the starting job next year. What does their outlook look like? And then I get to it, Glenn, and I've been asked this question so many times. Well, could they take a high school quarterback? For me, I'm not saying Joe Sloan hasn't kept relationships with high school quarterbacks. It's just so hard, like we talked about on that live show on Thursday, when you've developed so many or put in so many time and resources into one player, it almost feels like it's going to have to be, and we mentioned this so many times, a specific quarterback fit that's willing to come down here and maybe not have a defined role. And I would argue that you might already have that in AJ Swan in terms of depth. I don't really know where they would add a quarterback and what they would be looking for in that situation unless you lose a guy or two in that room.
Yeah, it's a tough one because, I think Swan is probably a guy, just total gut feeling that we see go. Like, I think this is total speculation on my part. And so take it for a grain of salt or whatever, you want to use measurement wise. But I think Swan is gone. And I think I would honestly say one of the two of Collins and Hurley is gone. And I don't have a good feeling on who of those two would be. But if that's the case, you would have essentially Garrett Nussmeier and then a backup quarterback, just one. And so I think that if LSU is going to go add somebody out of the portal this year, I would imagine that it's somebody that has some running ability. That's the type of quarterback that I think LSU would need to bring in here. And I think probably the biggest thing for me is bringing in somebody that can compete with Nuss. I think going into this year, AJ Swan, Ricky Collins, Colin Hurley, I just don't think any of those guys were challenging Nussmeier this year. And I'm not saying you're bringing in somebody to replace Nussmeier or anything like that, but somebody that will push him to be better. And I think, different players react differently when you have those kinds of guys or have those kinds of conversations. Garrett Nussmeier's, in my opinion, or just based off of what he says, how he acts, how he operates, how he goes to work every day, I think he's the kind of player that would embrace that kind of competition because he's been in those kinds of competitions his entire career, whether it's with Jaden Daniels the first year or, kind of his, when they brought Jaden Daniels in, he was competing with Miles Brennan and Jaden and a couple other guys. And then his freshman year, he was competing with Max Johnson and a couple of other players during his true freshman year. So really, I think that there's an avenue here for where Nuss can not only develop as a player himself, but where LSU could bring in some good, healthy competition behind him. And to me, the perfect profile for a player like that is somebody who can run the ball, be a little bit more of a dynamic athlete out there. Maybe not the passer that Garrett Nussmeier is, and maybe that's a reason why the LSU wants to bring him in here to say, hey, here's what we've done with Jaden Daniels as a mobile quarterback and as a passer. Here's what we've done with Garrett Nussmeier as a passer. We know you can run. We know you've got athletic. We know you're athletic and can do all these things. We can help turn you into a really complete passer too. And that I think could be very attractive for a quarterback. I don't know who that would be. But again, I think that LSU probably will attack the portal. I think it's probably a little too late to go get another freshman quarterback. And honestly, if you're going to go get a freshman quarterback at this late stage, you're probably going to have to overpay for him. because you're going to have to make sure that the money outweighs the relationships that maybe he has with another program. And honestly, like, if you go in and you bring in a freshman quarterback, is that guy really going to compete with Nussmeier next year? Like,
Yeah,
I,
it's fair.
I don't think so. Like, I think you have to hit the portal for that position. And I think we'll see kind of what kind of attrition happens there.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that's kind of my spiel on the quarterback spot. Like, bring in somebody that can compete with Nuss, challenge him, hopefully maybe teach him how to run a little bit. I don't know. I just like just kind of help him out in some areas and push him a little bit. So that would be kind of my goal for quarterback. I do kind of want to touch on his last quote that I touched on in our piece on Monday, which I thought was really interesting. Maybe one of the more interesting quotes he talked about, but the fact of how revenue sharing will factor in to how LSU approaches this thing over the next couple of years or next
Mhm.
couple of months. Like I think it's important that we kind of talk a little bit about it because you mentioned the salary cap aspect of this thing, and that directly ties into the revenue sharing aspect of this because there's going to be, from what we understand, and there's still some of it that's been not been made public yet, but
Yeah.
I would imagine that there's going to be some kind of hard cap on these teams to where they just can't spend everything. Like they can't overspend or can't. There's going to be a pool of money that's allowed for the players to have out of this revenue sharing details or whatever, or a pool of whatever it is. So, like, I think for me, the thing that he said was, and I'll read the quote here, it's what you do prior to kicking in, and that's where everybody is keeping their cards closed. Like
Yeah.
I think he's talking about um, what happens prior to when revenue sharing kicks in next summer. It's that's going to be where I think a lot of the decisions are made for LSU, and because they're going to have they they're supposedly going to have all this money to spend, and they've got to spend it. Like once
Yeah.
revenue sharing comes around, you might not be able to spend it, so you've got to be able to spend it on this roster, and so that's why I think part of that ties into why he's going to be so aggressive. Because he goes on to say, because that is the accelerator. You want to be able to retain, you want to be able to go out to the transfer portal and do that before revenue sharing so you can begin to balance off what your roster looks like in terms of the
Mhm.
numbers when everyone comes into one locker room. If you just waited until revenue share, it's going to be a different look to different players. You can balance things off if you're aggressive here in the next month, and that's why that's what we plan to be. So, like, I think that's to me telling me that whatever money they have, they're going to spend it here over the next month. And
Yeah.
whether that's going to be 2025 class, whether that's going to be through the transfer portal, I would imagine that LSU is going to spend all of the money that they can to improve the roster. And look, I think that this is going to be a very interesting next couple weeks. Brian Kelly said it's going to be a very fun time for him, and he
Mhm.
might grow a few extra gray hairs, but that this is part of the nature of the business, and that they're going to go out there and they're going to put their best foot forward this year. And I think that I think just from what he said today, like, it sounds like they have the resources to be a little bit more competitive than they were at this time a year ago.
Yeah, and then just kind of wrap up on that quote that I thought was really interesting towards the end of the presser. He goes when he talked about why this year for this instead of being when they were more conservative in that 2024 cycle. He said just didn't present for us in a manner that we felt like we were going to be able to reach last year on some things, and just didn't think at the time that we were looking at players that made sense for us. They duplicated a lot of things. We don't have that duplication in the program anymore, and so that's why in certain areas we'll be aggressive. We could probably go more into that, but I think that the idea that some of the players in the portal duplicated things for them, I think that's to somewhat the truth, but I also think it could be also identified as a misevaluation on some of the players that maybe they thought they were going to have, didn't get the production they wanted. Because at certain spots, you can make a case of a guy they were in on could have made a difference this year in 2024. But you mentioned gray hairs, Glenn. Recent dad. I don't have any yet. I don't think you do either. But if this portal cycle combined with recruiting and a bowl game, which Glenn's crossing his fingers for Nashville, baby. He wants to spend New Year's in Nashville. That's what he
Music
wants.
City,
So
Music
Music
City
City
Bowl.
Bowl. It's going to be a lot of fun. And obviously, what we want you to do is check out Go 24/7, a great deal right now that you need to take advantage of. 75% off. Glenn, that comes out to around $3 and some change per month by the time you get to it. So if you want not Glenn and I to eat, if you want Addie, 5-month-old Addie, to be able to eat and be able to have a roof over her head, then you will check out Go 24/7. No
I'll just
pressure
say this: it's the most important time of the
of the
year
year.
for recruiting and for what we do best, and so we're going to
Yes.
be on top of all of it. And we hope to see some of you guys out there. And yeah. And if you don't want to buy the Go 24/7, so subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can come listen to us rumble or babble for a couple of times a week. And
Yeah.
so yeah, we hope to see you on the site. I mean, the board has been crushing recently. We've got
Yes.
some really great interaction with our subscribers right now. We've got updates coming every single day on potential recruits and portal news and intel ahead of the early signing period. So still a couple big splashes LSU's looking to try to close off here, both on the football and the basketball side. So hopefully you'll tune in and we'll have some good conversation over on our message boards. But
Would love to
happy
see it.
holidays, everyone.
Yes, enjoy your Thanksgiving. Have a good time with the family, and we'll catch you again later on the week. LSU Oklahoma should be a fun game with a lot at stake as the Sooners and the Tigers take the field for one last time at Tiger Stadium in 2024. We appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and also check us out on all those podcast feeds as well. We'll catch you next time here on the Go 24/7 podcast.